Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on mapping non-state armed groups' transnational connections. This webinar is part of a new IISS briefing series exploring key features and dynamics of non-state armed groups globally. My name is Caroline Emmett. I'm an Associate Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development at IISS. The Conflict, Security and Development Programme monitors the political, security and economic significance of armed conflict and instability around the world, both for those countries affected, but also regional actors, great powers, and the wider geopolitical order. We publish the Armed Conflict Survey annually, which offers a review of all active conflicts, as well as in-depth analysis of the hot topics of interest. I'm very pleased to be chairing the event today on the increasingly challenging topic of transnational connections between states and non-state armed groups around the globe. Of course, these sort of transnational connections are not a new phenomenon, but in recent times, important shifts in how violent conflict manifests itself have taken place, which includes the proliferation of non-state armed groups. Concurrently, geopolitical developments such as heightened great power competition have fueled states' desire for and ability to undermine rivals and to shift regional balances of power through the use of proxy warfare. In this session, we're going to explore the growing interconnectedness between states and non-state armed groups. We'll tackle three key areas. Firstly, we're going to look at the drivers for the growing interconnectivity. Secondly, to look at how this dynamic manifests itself. And thirdly, to look at possible policy responses to this. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel of experts. Firstly, Dr. Benjamin Petrini, our Research Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development at IISS, currently in the Washington office. Benjamin's areas of expertise include drivers of armed conflict and instability, development response and strategies to address conflict and insecurity, as well as global challenges such as forced migration. His focus area for today is going to be Sub-Saharan Africa. Secondly, we have John Raine, IISS's Senior Advisor for geopolitical due diligence. His research includes the use of proxies, the use of non-kinetic force as a means of projecting power, and alternative approaches to conflict resolution. His focus area for today is on Middle East, North Africa. And lastly, Antoine Levesque, our Research Fellow for South and Central Asian Defense Strategy and Diplomacy. He specializes in South Asian policies towards China, regional nuclear issues, and Pakistan's political and security perspectives. And his focus area for today will be Asia, with a focus really specifically on Pakistan, Afghan links to non-state armed groups. Welcome. I'm really glad that you've joined us today for this webinar. Before we start, just a final note on housekeeping. We really welcome questions from the audience, and we'll try to make the discussions as interactive and inclusive as possible. To that end, please could you add any questions that you may have to the question and answer box, and we'll seek to answer them during the question and answer session at the end. Our speakers are now going to offer some initial remarks of up to 10 minutes each, and then we'll go to question and answer. So Benjamin, if I can start with you, could you give us an overview of non-state armed groups and state-sponsored dynamics in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you very much, Caroline. It is great to be here. Well, the landscape of non-state armed groups in Sub-Saharan Africa is extremely varied, and I have to say that our inclusive definition at IISS works very well for this region. In fact, we do not distinguish between motives and drivers of groups, be them political, economic, or criminal in nature, but rather we focus on those groups that are actively engaged in violence, that either fight the state or one another, and most importantly, that have the operational and strategic capacity, meaning those groups that are organized. In terms of trends and data, according to the annual survey conducted by the International Committee of the Red Cross, 36% of non-state armed groups globally emanate from Sub-Saharan Africa, so more than 1 in 3. Further, the number of non-state conflicts in Africa, meaning those conflicts that are fought only between non-state armed groups without the participation of the state, has increased this number exponentially decade by decade since the end of the Cold War. Just very briefly, in the 2 decades between the average number of these non-state conflicts per year was 22. In the decade of the 2010, between 2010 and 2020, that average number rose to 34. But it is only in the last few years that non-state conflicts have boomed. Since 2017, the average number of non-state conflicts per year is 44, so more than doubling the post-Cold War decade. And I think that this is an important background to the discussion. This trend is underpinned, obviously, as you said, Caroline, by the well-known proliferation of non-state armed groups with diverse reach, nature, and motives. And the groups that are relevant to this region include the rebel groups, highly localized communal insurgencies, identity-based groups based on ethnicity or religion, self-defense groups, very importantly, and religious extremists. And as I said, all of these, they either fight the state or one another. Now, the definition of transnational conflict is relatively straightforward. It is an armed conflict that extends or operates across national boundaries. That's very clear. However, when it comes to its application to the continent and its various conflict theaters, that is when the picture of armed conflict in Africa becomes much more blurred and of difficult interpretation. But let me turn now on how the transnational ties of non-state armed groups manifest, which I have to say, first of all, it goes beyond just the states sponsoring non-state armed groups or the relationship between non-state armed groups and external states. There is more to that. The first clear manifestation of transnational conflicts concerns the non-state armed groups creating sanctuaries across the borders of the countries where they operate. In this case, border regions become safe havens where non-state armed groups can relocate, or borderlands can be used as areas to recruit, to train, and plan. On the other hand, the states have to respect the sanctity of borders, obviously, and as the legal jurisdiction is cut across at least 2 different states, non-state armed groups are able to exploit the constraints in the authorizing environment to respond militarily to them. Now, this is a diffuse and common situation. The US State Department designates 75 foreign terrorist groups globally, and 32 of them, 32 out of 75, use border areas in their operations. One of the main global hotspots is the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin. Here, 8 of these foreign terrorist groups conduct operations spanning across 6 countries: Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Nigeria, and Cameroon. But there is also like 4 more of them that have had sporadic attacks in the last few years and whose northern provinces are affected, meaning Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, and Benin. But this dynamic is also present in other hotspots, in other places on the continent, on the DRC Rwanda border, the Sudan, Chad border, the border between Somalia and Kenya, and others. The second type of transnational connections concerns non-state armed groups having ties to religious extremist groups of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In this case, since 9/11 and exponentially in the last decade, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda have established regional offshoots on the continent, from West Africa to the Great Lakes region to Mozambique and parts of East Africa. And a new dynamic has taken place in the last couple of years. We have observed an overlap between international jihadist groups and local dynamics. And here is how the transnational element becomes of difficult interpretation. What happened is that there has been an important shift by religious extremist groups from an international dimension to a more local one. This means that jihadist groups in Africa have become more involved in local conflicts and intertwined with community and ethnic conflicts, either by steering pre-existing conflicts or by hijacking local grievances on access and management of natural resources, for example, in areas outside of state control. By doing so, extremist groups have abandoned or lost some of their transnational links and now operate almost exclusively on a local basis. In this sense, the affiliation to ISIS and Al-Qaeda by local jihadist groups is more like a franchise, and there is little evidence of any operational connection to international terrorist groups. The affiliation of local extremist groups with transnational groups has become looser, and their international ties to ISIS and Al-Qaeda have weakened. The connection between insurgent groups appear now limited to intra-regional collaboration. This dynamic is present in Somalia, but increasingly in the Sahel and the Lake Chad too, where religious extremist groups have been fighting one another for a few years now. I should also add that Mozambique falls into that category. Finally, the third type of transnational ties are those between non-state armed groups and sponsoring states. According to ICRC data, again, in 2023, 27% of armed groups globally received support from other states. In Africa, this practice of third-party states sponsoring groups engaged in domestic conflicts is not new at all. And there are three forms of transnational ties that have stood out since decolonization. The first one is African states supporting groups engaged in regime change, like liberation movements in Portuguese colonies or rebel groups in minority white regimes, or so-called reform rebels that wanted to advance a more just and equal political system. That's the first type of African states supporting non-state armed groups. The second one is the support of groups in proxy wars that were fought to advance the interest of the US, of the USSR during the Cold War. For example, the notable example is Congo. And the third form concerns interstate conflict and disputes, where African states pursue their foreign policy objectives by supporting non-state armed groups that are active in rival states. While this practice took off between 1975 and 1990, it has become protracted since, and it is prominent today. So this is the most important form of transnational connections. We have witnessed states that are in competition with other states to assert a regional dominance on the continent. And the support to non-state armed groups, either direct or covert, has been one of the most frequent foreign policy tools that regimes have used to destabilize rival states and undermine their domestic security. One very clear trend of this is the increasing internationalization of civil wars, meaning those civil wars with intervention by a third-party state. According to the UCDP, the number of these internationalized civil wars in Africa skyrocketed. There were 12 of them between 1991 and 2010. There were 27 of them between 2011 and 2020. And in 2022, the last year on record, there was 16 internationalized internal conflicts, a number that is almost double those civil wars without foreign intervention. So this reveals a picture where more and more third-party countries today directly intervene in domestic armed conflicts of states. Now, very briefly, I know I'm out of time, but to conclude, in terms of the drivers, I would single out 4 of them, and we can go more into that in the discussion. The first one is the one that the most obvious one that you mentioned, the geopolitical competition and the global fragmentation. This in Africa takes place with intervening external actors that are not only great powers, but increasingly middle powers. Gulf countries and Turkey in theaters like Sudan, Somalia, the Sahel, security providers like Rwanda in Mozambique, and Russia, obviously, in the Sahel and the CAR. This dynamic has been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, obviously. The second driver is the one that I referred to already in my remarks about the rise of religious extremist groups on the continent. The third one that would deserve much more attention is the illicit trafficking of people, of light weapons, illegal drugs, wildlife, minerals, etc. And the fourth driver to me is the porous borders and the marginalized areas and peripheries of countries where state lack control and security presence. Let me stop there and turn back to you, Caroline. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Benjamin, for some really good insight into Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and I will definitely return to some of those topics in Q&A. If I can turn now, though, to John now, can you share with us some insights on non-state armed groups, state-sponsored dynamics in Middle East, North Africa? Maybe, for example, the drivers of Iran's network of influence amongst non-state armed groups.
Thanks, Caroline, and thank you, Benjamin. Much of what Benjamin has said about the phenomenon in Africa of non-state armed groups transfers also to the Middle East. I particularly want to pick up Benjamin's reference to the elastic phrase non-state armed groups, which serves really well in the Middle East, because one of the features of non-state armed groups in the Middle East is their proliferation and the variety of them. There's a disproportionately high number and wide variety of these groups in Middle East, North Africa area. If we do a rough calculation of the number of people whose lives on a day-to-day basis are ruled by non-state armed groups rather than governments, it comes out around about 20-25 million people. So that's a lot of people spread over a large area who are now part of an ecosystem of non-state armed groups rather than being governed by their lawfully constituted governments. That's worth bearing in mind and looking at why is that so in the Middle East? Well, there are historic reasons. Some of these going back prior to the modern era to dispensations allowed to communities and ethnic groups under the Ottomans, then reinforced in the post-colonial period by governments which were felt not fully to represent in their boundaries or in their makeup, not fully representing the various groups within their country. And this reinforced a reliance on local identities. And that means that these groups have been around for a long time. So longevity and social entrenchment is an important feature of the NSAG phenomenon in the Middle East. There are now generations who've known nothing other than some form of life under not a state, but a non-state and a non-state armed group at that. So many commentators have picked up on this and referred to it either as the phenomenon of militias, of terrorist groups, which was very popular nomenclature in the 80s and 90s, or freedom movements. But I think now, given the length of time that these organizations have been around and the various changes in their role and their mission, I think this phrase non-state armed groups is particularly helpful in understanding, first of all, the role that these groups now play, and secondly, the awkwardness that they pose in regional dispensations, and particularly conflict resolution, because they're not going away. They're almost more of a feature, or as equally a feature, of the dynamics of the region as states themselves. There is a second particular reason why in the region non-state armed groups are so important. It's their geopolitical leverage. As we all discovered on October the 7th, the ability of non-state armed groups in the Middle East to seize control of the global security agenda is pretty much unparalleled. I think with the exception of what Al-Qaeda did, of course, 2 decades earlier, Palestinian groups and some other groups in the region have been able systematically to escalate their agenda within the global security agenda and to oblige states in the region and states far from the region to configure around that. So ignoring NSAGs in the Middle East as something which, whilst many states have aspired to, turns out in practice not to be possible because of that extraordinary leverage that they have. And a third distinguishing feature in the region, this takes me, Caroline, to your point, is Iran. So Iran is the only country which has made the fostering and the development of transnational links with non-state armed groups a strategic capability. The network of influence, as we described at IISS, is unparalleled, both in its reach and in the systematic nature in which it has been developed and resourced by the Iranian regime. Now, this has had a number of results. One is it has perpetuated the phenomenon of non-state armed groups from Yemen through to Iraq via Syria. Groups have been maintained as active non-state, highly armed in some cases, groups by the Iranian regime. The second thing that it's done is it has given Iran a lot of the leverage which these groups have, and has enabled it to construct both a mechanism for waging sub-threshold indirect warfare against its adversaries, primarily Israel, but also Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And secondly, it's given Iran a forward cordon belt of countries and military installations which can absorb its adversaries, what might have been its adversaries' attacks on Iran itself. It now has this cordon to absorb them. And thirdly, on the interesting point of transnationalization, Iran has become a hub for the recruitment and deployment of members of non-state armed groups from a multiplicity of nationalities, both within the region, but also in the region that Antoine's going to talk about through the Fatamun and Zainabiyun, who come from Pakistan and Afghanistan, still being recruited by our IRGC and moved into Middle Eastern theatres. So Iran's role has transformed the nature of non-state armed groups, and it has also meant that within the region there is a state that is invested in the perpetuation of extra state power. And an interesting thing that was happening before October the 7th and Hamas's attack on Israel was a growing consensus that states needed to regain control of the agenda in the region. And that consensus stretched to Tehran. It was not, certainly in the case of Tehran, an abandonment of any of the regional causes or the need to solve the regional conflicts. It was just a prioritization of state control over the agenda, explicitly in order to reduce conflict and promote economic development. And the problem for states with non-state armed groups is that states have many agendas, economic, social. Non-state armed groups tend to have one, sometimes very fiercely focused on one agenda. So after a very long period, after decades of proliferation of non-state armed groups, disruption of regional state-led agendas, going right back to the Iraq Civil War and the Syrian Civil War, regional powers had come to a consensus articulated through a series of agreements, of which, of course, the Abraham Accords were probably the most prominent, that it was time for states to reassert control of the agenda. That's been usurped, and already we see both in, of course, in the occupied territories, in Gaza, and also in Yemen, non-state armed groups are exercising sufficient control. In the case of the Houthi in Yemen, sufficient control to impact on the global economy through interdiction of shipping in the Red Sea. So the region still has a large-scale geopolitical problem with the proliferation, entrenchment, and the capabilities of non-state armed groups. Without wanting to get too far into policy prescription, there are, however, a number of both experiences and features of these groups that give some grounds for optimism. First of all, they are all focused on ultimately on their local agendas. The idea of them coalescing into an effective transnational fighting force needs to be treated with some skepticism. The axis of resistance and subgroupings, such as the Islamic resistance of Iraq, these tend to be rather hollow structures. They've never yet translated into something other than a rallying call or a convenient moniker attached to a particular cause. So whereas we saw representatives of Iraq-based non-state armed groups going to Lebanon to show solidarity with Hezbollah, what we haven't seen is any real mobilization across the broader network in the Middle East. And Iran itself has tried to make more of this than perhaps is the case, particularly with the axis of resistance. The axis of resistance, an idea promoted vigorously by Qasem Soleimani, has had more credibility and impact as an idea than as a military or paramilitary structure. So with groups focused largely on their local their local grievances and ambitions, that means that a high value attaches to either inclusion in conflict resolution of these groups, or at least an addressing through existing state structures of the grievances and the reasons for the continuing existence of non-state armed groups. And in the case of the Houthis, the Saudis themselves were keen not to escalate further with the Houthis because of their confidence that they were getting some way towards a peace process. So I think the first and most obvious way to deal with them is on their particular local grounds and grievances. I think the second issue is that whilst many of the non-state armed groups are committed to some form of armed resistance or activity, some way needs to be found to negotiate them away from increasing militification, as it's known, or militarization. So weapons proliferation is a separate problem. Conventional weapons proliferation, certainly in post-conflict areas, is largely unaddressed, something to which the international community can make a contribution. And whereas these groups will be understandably unwilling to sacrifice their arsenals for nothing, they may well be prepared to do so as part of a broader disarmament agreement. But that problem of weapons proliferation can't go unaddressed, and it may be that including it in discussions which are intended to lead towards some sort of conflict resolution would be a useful interim step. And the third area, which I'm sure is common Africa and in other areas, is that many of these groups have thrived on the failure of states themselves to provide social services and basic amenities. So states that are fierce rather than strong have been the curse of the Middle East and North Africa. So fierce enough to wage war, and sometimes that has sadly take the shape of civil war, but not strong enough to deliver under testing circumstances to their population. So addressing some of the physical consequences of being an excluded power, which is what, of course, the NSAGs are, that too would go some way towards de-escalation with the groups. My final thought on this is that the extraordinary proliferation and strength of non-state armed groups in the Middle East, it's probably not a problem that gets simpler if you make it bigger. So the idea of a grand conference at which all the parties are brought together and then with the wave of a wand reconciled and persuaded to some, I don't think that's the way this goes. They're all too deeply embedded in local disputes, and it is their very local focus which offers the best key to some sort of at least interim resolution. Caroline, thank you. I'll end there.
Thanks, John, and thanks for some insightful comments there, especially on how to some maybe policy responses for dealing with it, which we'll definitely pick up in later on in the webinar. We can turn to you now, Antoine, and maybe focus particularly on Kashmir and Pakistan and Afghan links. Can you share with us some insights from that region?
Thank you, Caroline. A good day to all who are on the call. I think a lot has been said already. I just want to pick up on a couple of points which are relevant to your questions. Benjamin, you mentioned porous and disputed borders. I think this is key in the case of South Asia, and particularly in the case of India, Pakistan, and the Kashmir question. And John, you talked about how non-state armed groups can affect the livelihoods of millions. I would extend that statement in the South Asian case, and particularly in the India-Pakistan case, to billions, because really what defines since 1998 the Kashmir question in relation to NSAGs and state involvement is the fact that we have India and Pakistan who are now nuclear weapon states. And so this poses a very different set of questions to the ones we've discussed so far, to do with escalation of interstate tensions and the possibility, and indeed, I think in the region, the belief that the involvement of NSAGs in action against another state than the one hosting them is almost always state-directed and calls for a state-directed, at least consideration, if not response. So what I'm saying here is that the nuclear overhang cannot be disassociated from any statements made, not just in the India-Pakistan context, but the wider Afghanistan-Pakistan context. Now, this is not the all in all. For students of deterrence, there's a question of escalation ladders. And clearly, what I find fascinating in the South Asia case is that you have the very high end, the possibility of nuclear weapons being used, high impact, fairly low probability question, coupled with the very low end of the conflict, the subconventional, which is almost a daily occurrence, certainly in the Pakistan-Afghanistan region. So the stakes are different, and yet the dynamics, the sociology, the ideology questions are there in similar ways to other regions in the world. I've been asked to say something specifically about Kashmir, but I think it's important to realize that the NSAG phenomenon covers the Afghanistan, Pakistan, indeed the India-Pakistan state dyads, but the wider South Asia and indeed Asia region. And it's very important to remember that all of these situations, these discrete involvements of non-state armed groups are specific enough to call for very specific analyses. So it's hard, and it's always a little hazardous to be generalizing. But to specifically respond on the Kashmir situation, I think it's important to realize that in the recent years, the non-state armed group activity has considerably diminished compared to the 1980, early 1990s onwards, when it really picked up. The nuclear predicament has been part of this since 1998, but particularly changes to do with Pakistan's national security, the reaffirmation of a ceasefire on the line of control. All of this has meant that the behavior of non-state armed groups in relation to Kashmir has been loosely tied to statecraft and related decisions. So in that sense, we're facing here a situation which is not quite as unique and dangerous as may have been some years prior. And we return therefore to some of the questions which Benjamin and John Rain have raised before, to do with management, I think primarily over the long term of the experience, expertise, and the learning curves which have taken place among a certain cohort of jihadists who have experience of the two Afghanistan wars, and could be then transplanted onto the India-Pakistan conflict. I think we haven't seen any of this take place since the Taliban took over Kabul in 2021. And that has been for the better of the region. But that said, there is a long, I think, a long tail to the relationship at a given moment between states and non-state armed groups. So this is owing to the fact that leaderships tend to survive, and their interests inherently evolve, and they evolve all the more that there are state motives which change. So what may have been at some point an objective for them, for example, in the 1980s, to achieve some form of conquest and control in the context of the Afghan jihad, may have turned into the quest for a relationship with the Pakistani state, translating itself into the possibility for Pakistan to extend strategic depth into Afghanistan. And throughout that period, there was also the question of instrumentalization by Pakistan of certain elements on its soil or in the Afghan context for fighting in the Kashmir situation. So all these different instrumentalizations and also the self-assigned objectives of groups mean that there's very little consistency over time of the drivers for behavior, and certainly the patterns we're seeing of groups emerging and going. The much better, I think, level of analysis has to be leadership, intellectuals, individuals who are able to reconstitute step-down groups and manage relations with states. The Afghan conflict brought itself a couple of interesting questions in terms of relations between state and non-state armed groups. Of course, the first one being that a non-state armed group, the Afghan Taliban, took over the capital and indeed the government of a whole country. That poses interesting questions over how to manage this over time, and what to do about this in the long term. And secondly, I think it poses an interesting question for Pakistan about how to really consistently demonstrate that it has broken off with previous practices that may have had their course until now. And it's very difficult, I think, for a state which may have partly supported non-state armed groups to be able to convince other states and the wider world that they are no longer involved in such activities. So that poses an interesting set of political, but also very practical security questions. And these two questions I've raised just solely in the context of the AFPAC region are essentially only vowed to be managed. They cannot be solved easily. They have to be managed over time. And this is what security agencies and militaries do best. I want to touch very briefly on Myanmar, which is an interesting case in the context of South Asia. I think we've seen an interesting set of reporting coming out. I defer here to my colleague Aaron Connolly, who is our IISS resident expert on Myanmar. But we've seen some interesting reporting coming out suggesting that China is both supporting the junta, as it has for many years, but is also supporting a lot more some of the non-state armed groups. And this points perhaps to a sharpening of geopolitical competition, but also I think a sense that there can be other state motives involved other than influence, control, and these can have something to do with internal issues, such as in the case of Myanmar, Chinese concern over criminal activity and the impact this is having in China. I would finally note that there are cases of insurgencies and groups active in South Asia, particularly in India, but also Nepal, which do not seem to have foreign state sponsorship. And these cases of non-sponsorship are just as interesting to follow. I think my time is up, so I'll stop there, but happy to take any questions any further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antoine, for your pitch on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the wider conflict landscape in Asia. I guess I'm going to take Chair's prerogative first and come back to what John was talking about. And he offered 3 key points on how we might seek to respond to the dynamics. You talked about dealing with the local issues, separating out or focusing very much on disarmament post-conflict as a way of demilitarization of groups, but also dealing with state failure itself. And he used the phrase fierce, not strong states. I wonder whether the other 2 panelists agree that with that kind of starter for 10 in terms of policy response. And I would offer a follow-on question as well, especially in dealing with the physical consequences of state failure. So we've been involved in Middle East, North Africa for a long time in trying to support state development post-conflict, yet it seems always to fail. Why is that? But first of all, to Antoine first, and then Benjamin, do you have anything to add on how to deal with the issues and policy responses?
Thank you. I mean, briefly in the South Asia context, I think the recent history has been to focus on security-heavy responses. And so that brings, in the context, particularly of India-Pakistan, it brings a whole set of questions about deterring not just non-state armed groups, which is an old discussion, but also secondarily deterring states from enabling, being permissive towards non-state armed groups. And that takes us down a whole set of questions about how do you do deterrence by punishment, by denial, and so compellence also, the public management of these issues, and the public and statecraft management questions to do with if there is an escalation which risks entering the conventional domain, risks escalation, how do you manage that? I think one common point to all of these questions is that it becomes extremely important to be listening to the states either perceived to be involved in such questions or proven to be, and to really try and understand their own motivations and their own sensitivities to being designated, to being named and shamed, etc. I think John's point around welfare and around conventional weapons are spot on and very valid in the case of Pakistan, particularly. It's very clear that you have cohorts, generations of individuals whose livelihood depends partly or wholly on fighting, and this vicious circle has to be broken. But it's by no means an easy one to do. Welfare being a major consideration, education being another. I think it's been very clear, lastly, from my conversations in Pakistan since 2021, that there is a very strong perception that in the case of the change of regime in Kabul, the remnants of conventional weapons, some of them very lethal, have made their ways into the hands of non-state groups, much to the sorrow of the security forces in Pakistan. Thankfully, we haven't seen too much of that re-emerge on the Kashmir side. I'll stop there.
Thanks, John. Benjamin, and then we'll come back to John. Yes,
thank you very much. I completely agree with the policy prescription, the thoughts that my colleagues had. The question of state failure is obviously the $1 million issue, the one that I think I mostly dedicated my career to try to answer, try to think about. And the first point that I want to tackle is precisely the one about governance and political settlement, and to scale it up a bit and being like, this is not only an issue of local governance, it's an issue, it's a structural issue that by not addressing it, then you have cycles of violence and cycles of conflict that are never ending. So to me, it is only through guaranteeing services, the economic rights, and social inclusion to all citizens that states can reinforce their legitimacy. But this is not only in the peripheries and the borderlands that we talked about today, but it is also in their capital cities. This process of buy-in by the state has to be accompanied by a process of political inclusion. And so addressing then the root causes of conflict, the very nature, the very political grievances. So opening up the political system so that groups in society are represented. So to me, there is a very holistic sort of view on how these issues should be tackled, and this is like the most structural part. Now, very briefly, to try to address how to tackle the very transnational conflict and what we talked about today. This is very referred obviously to Sub-Saharan Africa. One would be ad hoc regional or sub-regional security coalitions sanctioned or supported by Western actors. These can take the forms of counterinsurgency or counterterrorism, stabilization and peace enforcement. But obviously, these can work as long as you have also a governance project, as I outlined earlier. On the diplomatic standpoint, which is critical when thinking about the transnationality of conflict, the transnational conflicts should be recognized as such by states. That's the first point. And so the interested state parties should iron out their differences through regional mediation and a clear vision of collective security, instead of trying to undermine one another via non-state armed groups. So some of the examples in the Sahel that we had with the G5 Sahel or the coalitions in the Lake Chad Basin, these were unsuccessful, but not because of the very nature of that coalition, for other reasons. But that's sort of the way to do it. The sharing of intelligence, the sharing of border patrol, etc. And so the West should try to provide incentives to do so. And the fourth, very briefly, and this is not any area that I have any expertise on, but is the device of a legal framework and the implementation to curb illicit trafficking, and so to cut off the source of funding for non-state armed groups. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Benjamin. John, do you have anything further to add?
It was quite a lot going on here intellectually, Caroline, but I'm going to pick out just a few things somewhat at random. One is one of the state problems that we have perhaps in the Middle East is a failure of devolution as much as anything else. And devolution is not a particularly fashionable concept in strong state cultures. But there's an interesting example going on with the Kurdish regional government at the moment, which is so far, despite continuing aspirations to full statehood on the part of the Kurds, and some of the bumpiness that's brought about in the relationship with Baghdad, it's succeeding as an experiment. So that's a sub-state solution to what still contains non-state armed groups. So I think we need to consider that as part of the available repertoire for statehood. So in some ways, overinvestment in the unitary state has been a big problem, certainly in the Middle East. It has great strengths. I think as the Gulf states have shown, where your revenue streams are strong enough, it enables you to achieve some prodigious feats of delivery in terms, if nothing else, of infrastructure. But it has weaknesses where applied elsewhere, particularly when you're managing a mosaic of ethnic groups in particular. So that's one point. The second was, I very much like Benjamin's point about a consensus amongst states. And I think just having a sufficient consensus which allows states to name this problem is a great start. So I can't imagine them, as I said earlier, having a grand conference at which all the problems are solved, but just one at which they acknowledge, perhaps through an existing multilateral organization, that we have a huge quantum of excluded power in the region, and it's our region. So if we look at a map, these are countries which we control. So what are we going to do about it? And that leads to a discussion of non-interference, of, I would hope, in my most optimistic mood, demilitarization, demilitification, and eventually inclusion.
Okay.
But I think just having an adequate consensus to name, as we're doing in this seminar, this is a real problem, this quantum of excluded power. Yeah. There is some really interesting questions. I know you're going to get onto them, Caroline. I just want to reference one about what happens in the new global order. And I think this is very problematic, because if you mean by the new global order, the one run by Russia and China are hugely invested in states qua states. You know, they're status quo state-based powers. They hate non-state armed groups, and in both cases have carried out vigorous programs of oppression against non-state armed groups. I think you're going to find that comes into collision with a lot of the aspirations of these groups to be heard and taken as groups in whatever, a devolved federal structure. So I don't think that a new world order holds any more could hold out any more hope of solving this. In fact, I think it would make it more difficult to solve this problem than the current order. Sorry, I just segued into that because that question.
You did, and I was about to. So I was going to the first question. So thank you. The question comes from a slightly different angle in terms of, do you think that the non-state armed groups agenda, if we can call it such a thing, will change with a shift to the US becoming head of the UN Security Council in December, or not? And that's open to anybody who would like to take that. John's mentioned New World Order, but well,
I don't really like that phrase. I'll take a quick stab at this, then perhaps Benjamin and Antoine. The US has been pretty consistent, I think, certainly under Blinken's leadership on foreign affairs, and there are conflicts rather than non-state armed groups which need to be resolved as conflicts on their own. So not the generic approach, but we take the kind of conflict-based approach here. One of the features of foreign policy under both Republican and Democrat administrations has been a reliance on prescription, and the continuing prescription through sanctions. I think you could expect that to continue. Of course, that is problematic, very problematic when you get on to inclusion, which ultimately you have to. But I wouldn't say that, I mean, setting aside any sort of electric storms that we get from a radical new administration, I wouldn't say that it's going to per se make this any more difficult. I think the US are open at the level of professional diplomacy to ideas as to how this problem is solved, partly because they've had to expend so much time and money and treasure on dealing with non-state armed groups.
Thanks.
I defer, Antoine.
Sure, I would just add to this perhaps the simple point that major power competition is seemingly the priority. I mean, more than seemingly. So I think if you can build a confidence building measure looking at these issues, particularly with China, this is useful. Afghanistan used to be one such case, perhaps less so now, but I don't think the point of no return has been crossed on this yet. It could reemerge as one. But just in terms of policy time, senior policymakers, maybe this conflict and possibly this proxy characterization or proneness of conflict as a subset of major power rivalry might take greater hold. So I might not be quite as optimistic. At the same time, I think there are formidable analytical lessons, analytical capabilities in the US system. There are fabulous documents which are put out by the State Department, by others, publicly to sort of document where we are. And there are major interstate initiatives at the UN Security Council to document all of this. So the watching brief continues. And this allows countries, I think, to step in if they feel they have an interest. But I see a narrowing, actually, of the interest in looking at non-state groups for what they are specifically.
Thanks, Antoine. So we're coming towards the end, but I'm going to quickly try and squeeze one more question in, which is with regard to what happens if the local population supports the legitimization of a non-state armed group, really out of a loss of faith in the state governance apparatus itself, and how can the international community respond to that, if at all? And Benjamin, I'll go quickly to you.
Yes, I mean, this is a case that obviously that cuts across region, but the first point that I would say here is that you have that case when the non-state armed group has been able to offer governance and services that the state has not. And so where you have a de facto quasi-state governance or quasi-state structures there. So those cases that I could think of Colombia in the past. I could think of, yes, several cases in Sub-Saharan Africa or the Kurdish region, which has a different arrangement, but a rebellion that sort of gets ingrained in the local terrain with the local population. And this goes back into sort of like the theories of guerrilla warfare. That's what Mao Zedong sort of taught us. I mean, that's you need to sort of get legitimacy with the local population if you want to win a war against the state. So obviously that becomes a conflict that is highly protracted and very difficult to tackle. But you will get to that stage after you have, as a state, you have offered and you have brought and continuous neglect for years and years. So it's not something that would just suddenly appear. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. I am going to draw a close now. I'm sorry that I didn't get to all of the questions, but I hope the audience will agree that we've had a fantastic and insightful webinar to the 3 different regions. If you're interested in non-state armed groups, and clearly you are because you come into the webinar, please do take a look at our site on IISS.org for more insightful analysis on this topic. Thank you very much, and I'll make a close now to the webinar.